Estaba hablando con el micrófono cerrado. Juan Fernando, damos inicio.
Demos un minutico, profe, por favor.
Ok, claro, perfecto. Yo estoy acá pendiente y me cuentas. Bueno. Buenos días para todos. A nombre de la Universidad de Antioquia y de la División de Innovación de la Vicerrectoría de Docencia, queremos darles la bienvenida a este tercer encuentro de una serie de 4 webinars que hemos venido desarrollando durante el presente mes de marzo, donde hemos venido presentando diversas perspectivas y miradas, conversando sobre creatividad, emprendimiento e innovación para el desarrollo de competencias en educación superior. Este ciclo está organizado para quienes nos han acompañado antes, pues les recuerdo, y para quienes hoy llegan por primera vez, contarles que este ciclo es organizado por la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad de Antioquia, el DAAD, Servicio Alemán de Intercambio Académico, la Universidad de Vechta en Alemania, la Universidad Técnica del Norte desde Ecuador, y apoyado entonces, como decía, por la División de Innovación de la Universidad de Antioquia y también por la Fundación Universidad de Antioquia. Esta iniciativa pues es financiada por el DAAD con fondos del Ministerio Federal de Cooperación Económica y Desarrollo de Alemania. Yo soy Alejandro Hurtado Aristizábal, profesor vinculado con la Universidad de Antioquia, actualmente acompañando los procesos de gestión curricular de la universidad desde la Vicerrectoría de Docencia, y estoy aquí para moderar este espacio, acompañarlos a ustedes como asistentes y pues al final, después de la ponencia, gestionar la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Recordarles a todos pues que, como ha ocurrido en las sesiones anteriores, los micrófonos de los asistentes pues están cerrados por defecto. Si en algún momento desean participar, pues pueden levantar la mano, y dadas las condiciones del ejercicio de hoy, que involucra en parte interpretación, ya que nuestro ponente nos va a hablar en inglés, les pediría que escriban las preguntas en el chat o en la sección de preguntas y respuestas, y yo más bien voy tramitando a medida que vayan apareciendo. En esta tercera sesión hablaremos sobre competencias docentes en los procesos de gestión de la innovación en educación superior. Contarles que nos acompaña pues el profesor Lucas Cherac. El profesor tiene una maestría en ciencias con enfoque en innovación y diseño para la sostenibilidad de la Cranfield University en el Reino Unido. Es magíster en desarrollo internacional de la Universidad de Viena y profesional en consultoría de negocios de la Universidad de Ciencias Aplicadas Wiener Neustadt. El profesor Lucas actualmente es asistente en investigación en el Departamento de Ciencias de la Educación de la Universidad de Werder en Alemania. Dentro del departamento es el responsable de la implementación científica y administrativa y del apoyo a diversos proyectos. Desde 2019 es responsable de las finanzas y la coordinación del proyecto de asociación de aprendizaje de la Unión Europea que se denomina Enseñanzas para el Cambio Transformador, Get Active, por un mundo sostenible de Viena. Asimismo, tiene amplia experiencia en instituciones de Viena, ya que es de nacionalidad pues, austríaca. El profesor realizará, como dije, su ponencia en inglés. En este momento le vamos a dar palabra. Le cedo la
Sandra.
palabra a nuestro asistente o acompañamiento desde la Agencia de Traducción de la Universidad de Antioquia para que nos hagan una explicación corta de cómo será el ejercicio de interpretación antes de darle paso a nuestro ponente. Así que, Juan Fernando, o desde la Agencia de Traducción, lo que nos quieran comentar.
Adelante, Sandra.
Buenos días, muchas gracias. El día de hoy contamos con interpretación de idiomas para todos los asistentes, así que en la parte inferior, si están desde un computador, en la parte inferior, al lado del chat, encontrarán la opción de activar la interpretación y seleccionar el idioma, bien sea inglés o español, como lo quieran escuchar. Y para quienes estén de dispositivos móviles, van a encontrar en la opción más, en los 3 puntos, la opción para activar la interpretación de lenguas. Si alguien tiene inconvenientes o dudas, estoy pendiente en el chat. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Sandra. Nuevamente señalar que la dinámica es, tendremos una ponencia por parte del profesor Lucas durante la primera parte de este encuentro y al final cerraremos pues con el ejercicio de preguntas y respuestas como hemos venido haciendo en las sesiones anteriores. Así que pues darle la palabra al profesor Lucas, la bienvenida y agradecerle su presencia en este espacio. Bienvenido profesor y adelante.
Thank you very much, Professor Alejandro Hurtado, for your kind introduction and presentation and giving me the opportunity today to speak about teaching competencies with a focus on innovation in higher education. My talk will look at various aspects of innovation. So at first, I want to define what does actually innovation mean? What do we understand by that? Looking at various theoretical frameworks. Then I will be talking from a more structural perception. What does innovation in higher education actually mean? Leading to what does it mean in terms of teaching? So looking specifically at competence-based education from an innovative perspective. And then also, what do we understand by innovative teaching competences? So what do we as teachers, as lecturers need to incorporate, need to understand when it comes to teaching, and what kind of competences do we need to have? This will then lead to the second perspective when it comes to teaching and learning, and that's the learning process. So learning experiences, and what do we understand by that from an innovative perspective? At the very end of my talk, I will give some examples of how we at our university, for example, have been looking at that, how to incorporate innovative processes and innovative possibilities of transforming the way we teach at our university. So the term innovation in itself is used in a great deal in different areas, that being advertising, in speeches, but maybe also in describing one's company or organization. The thing is, the term innovation is used much more than the actual innovation then takes place. Russell Raff, for example, states in his article, When Innovation Fails, that even when organizations are not necessarily doing anything groundbreaking or new, they still call it innovation, just because it sounds greater. Well, he says, obviously, those are not innovations, rather they're simply improvements. So looking at innovation from a university perspective, one recognized author of the subject of innovation is Clayton Christensen. And in his book, The Innovative University, Changing the DNA of Higher Education from Inside Out, he defines different types of innovation. One innovation, or what he defines as sustaining innovation, is a process, a system, or modification that improves an existing product or system. It may make it better, bigger, more efficient, and or more beneficial to the end user. An example of sustaining innovation is a new updated model of a car that gets better gas mileage, for example. On the other hand, there is the so-called term disruptive innovation. And this is that kind of innovation that creates significant change. This represents an innovation that brings to market a product or service that is not as good as the best traditional offerings, but is more affordable and easier to use, particularly in the beginning of the product life. So in putting it in other terms, disruptive innovation replaces the original complicated, expensive product with so much more affordable and simple that the new population of customers now has enough money and skills to buy and readily use the product. This from a very business perspective, but what does that mean for universities? From a structural perspective, innovation in higher education happens at various levels. One could be, for example, to focus on producing so-called triple threat graduates. What is understood by that is a so-called triple threat graduate possesses, for example, an internship, has been participating at a long-term project, and also has an industry recognized credential along with their bachelor's or master's degree. Because one of the biggest critiques of higher education is that its graduates are usually not work ready. Another perspective is to utilize experiential marketing as a new enrollment management strategy. So the idea is, how can we get high school students leaving school that want to continue their studies at university level, how do we get them enrolling into our universities? And for the future, that means we need to provide them with maybe engaging online short courses in a way that they can experience the value of a university's education. A third aspect is to provide so-called 24 to 48-hour admission decisions. Usually when students apply for university, at least from a German perspective, I can tell, students would wait weeks, months, until they hear a decision on their admissions application. Well, maybe they are lucky to receive an admission, maybe they are not. And what are they going to do afterwards? And who's going to be responding quicker? So usually what happens is the ones that respond faster obviously are going to be the ones that the student is going to choose in the majority of terms. Fourth aspect, in terms of structural innovation, is to develop so-called online education worthy of your brand in terms of the university that you're presenting, the ideas that the university wants to share with their students. So online education nowadays, obviously, and maybe also another trigger was the pandemic. It's no longer nice to have, but it's a must be. And the idea is to create spaces, world-class online instructions for those students. That being world-class online mentoring and advising, for example. But so far, too few institutions have strived to achieve that. Another aspect could be to offer condensed or maybe less expensive bachelor's degrees. I don't know from the perspective of Colombia, but I know from the perspective of Ecuador that usually people would have to pay for their tuition. In Germany, you have to pay, but it's very marginal. But in many other countries, usually bachelor's degrees, master's degrees are quite expensive. So the question is, are there opportunities to provide students with condensed and maybe less expensive bachelor's degrees? The sixth one is launch evergreen degree program. So in terms of lifelong learning, and I'll come back to that later on in my talk, lifelong learning is one of the most important outcomes of an education. So it's not about just the degree, but how do we create structures to support students and graduates as lifelong learners. So part of the alumni section, but also already throughout the studies, the degrees people would pursue. Identify and develop every shared service possible. So what universities tend to do, we love to reinvent the wheel. So we tend to have more wheels than necessary, instead of just easily sharing those same wheels among other institutions. More resources become available online, like for example, library services, where the idea is to share services. So instead of owning things, we would be borrowing, sharing those kind of services, which would also, in the end, lower the costs. And last, before going to a more teaching perspective, look to non-degree educations being as one of the fastest revenue growth and mission-driven expansion opportunities. So one of the problems we're facing with universities is, well, we are offering degrees, and if they are just offering degrees, then they're going to be in big trouble. Because the age demographic of traditional age students is going to change dramatically. And then also the so-called market, that maybe being Google or many other employers, they're clearly indicating when it comes to hiring, it's not about degrees, but about skills that university students take with them when they leave the university. Because the problem is, for example, looking at my children who are around the age 5 and 6, jobs that they will pursue in 15, 20 years from now, they don't exist. And that's a dramatic change we're going to see in the next couple of years. So that's something that universities will need to focus on as well. There is a spelling mistake on my slide. I'm sorry for that. So looking at innovation in higher education, still from a structural perspective, but also from a teaching perspective, there are 6 main examples of innovation in higher education. Number one, or one of them definitely, is competency-based learning and competency-based education. It isn't necessarily an example of innovation in higher education, but a move towards competency-based education can lead to other innovations, using technology to personalize a student's navigation of to-be mastered content, for example. If we look at asynchronous learning, we understand the need for asynchronous access to this content when this access is not through a dated university learning management system, but something more authentic to the student, maybe even accessed on their own mobile devices. So we see digital skills come into place here as well. So competency-based education should obviously be more student-centered and efficient. Another aspect when it comes to innovation, for example, is the aspect of video streaming, flipped classroom, or e-learning trends. As we've seen over the last year, we have had to create different learning fields, different learning spaces. So flipped classroom, for example, is an opportunity in using that digital place and digital space by creating videos that replace lectures with valuable class time. So what happens with a flipped classroom, the learning content is prepared at home, and we come to class, that being in a virtual class as well, where what was learned at home is then applied in a presence setting. So students tend to learn for and by themselves. We try to create a higher student engagement and also more interaction and face-to-face time. This also creates the opportunity of working in smaller groups. Why does flipped classroom matter? Well, on one hand, it inspires change. The way we as teachers need to rethink and reflect on our own teaching. And we hopefully create a space where students are more motivated, by then improving the quality of interaction between students. Obviously, there are some risks there as well, as with any other concept, teaching concept. It obviously relies highly on motivated learners. You need a working technology, internet accessibility. Not all students learn well through visual learning. And flipped homework is still homework. Open curriculum, for example. Maybe you have run across the term MOOCs, or Massive Open Online Courses. They're great ideas, but one of the biggest challenges, obviously, is the assessment and the so-called feedback loops, and then also the certification of those. And therefore, still are not that reliable. Another aspect is the so-called changing nature of faculty. So now, today, through those so-called digital networks of information, we make access to data and areas of specialty ubiquitous, particularly in the scientific fields. So therefore, researchers no longer need to be in the same physical location to collaborate, like we're doing right now, for example. This change will then reduce the attractiveness of many universities for so-called expert faculty. So for example, a faculty member may choose to teach at a small institution in a rural setting and yet collaborate on research with faculty in a large urban environment. The changing revenue sources for institution funding is another aspect that needs to be looked upon. Obviously, we have a massive impact due to the coronavirus on the global economy. But already for many, many years, funding at higher education institution has become more and more important than not just only being that through state funding, but also trying to find funding on a more national, global scale, and by that cooperating with other countries, with other universities in different countries, like this project is allowing us, for example. And last, digital textbooks. So this is also, again, and I'm seeing that from a scientific research perspective, what is trying to be achieved is to make textbooks available online for free as an open source textbooks. And the same is happening in research right now. Yeah, so now it's not that you have to have a, what's it called? A membership of a certain journal. You can actually now, as a reader, go to most of the journals and look at the articles for free, because now the researcher has to provide those articles and the funding for that. So more and more is available online as in free open source, and that also applies to teaching, to textbooks. The second slide that continues with that is also, or are also, examples of innovation in higher education. But the thing is, they're not entirely realized, or are still at an early stage, maybe in their so-called infancy, or are not widely adopted. So I'm not going too much into that detail, apart from the very last one, so-called new pedagogies. One of them I already talked about, so competency-based learning, but there are others that are starting to be more and become more and more important. That being, for example, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, or also scenario-based learning. So the shift and the focus, as the same with competency-based learning, goes towards the student, and the idea behind that, and I'll come to that later when we look at the learning perspectives as well, is about creating places where the student solves real-world problems. So coming back to the competency-based education, because at least at our university, this has been wide and big discussion and an ongoing process in, at the end, creating a framework where we said those are the competences that we want to incorporate into our studies. I would like to talk about the benefits of competency-based education. One being that students have the opportunity to work on their own pace. So the strength of competency-based training lies in the fact that it puts the ownership of learning into the students and let them meet a certain big picture understanding. Students simply don't just move on with a big gap in their understanding, rather they work at their own pace until they prove the mastery. And they are assessed right exactly when they are confident to demonstrate their competences. So exactly in a way that it fits them, in a way that captures who they really are. Flexibility means that competence-based education's flexibility is to level where students can enter a program at any level with enough credit given to their prior experience. So it really doesn't matter when and where they acquire their knowledge, but just an assurance that they know it. So there is no set semester, no rigid classes. Rather, students control and steer their learning through hands-on projects and assessments. The idea is also to gain real-world experience. So the idea of higher education in general is to groom up students from becoming effective leaders in their chosen field. So beyond accomplishing just grades, what is more in demand now is gaining real-life skills, like I was saying beforehand. That there is a higher demand in real-life skills. Then there is this personalized way of teaching. So competence-based education portrays student learning in a transparent, authentic manner with enough room for personalized training. So teachers in a competence-based education develop meaningful, engaging projects for students and work together, giving feedback, revise their work to hit the mastery of standards. So as a teacher, the role is going to shift from giving content, but rather providing a path where the students follows this path, and we give, as teachers, give feedback and also moderate this process. Then there is also timely support. So in contrast to traditional teaching, where students had to fail to receive remedial support, in a competence-based assessment model, the students get additional support even during the process of building knowledge and skills. So the formative assessments, along with the effective feedback, are the strong points of competence-based education. So a real competence-based program comes with a clear purpose and a vibrant culture. So what it also does, it blends in values, opinions, relationships, and routines together that form its very foundation. So from looking at it from a design perspective, design principles state that any competence-based education program should be purpose-driven, should spell equity, it should develop a culture of learning and development, and lastly, should empower a distributed leadership. Well, assessment and grading is definitely a novelty in those terms. The assessment system is one of the biggest advantages of competency-based learning. So instead of a summative assessment like we are used from a traditional system and the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which only looks into including sort of areas like memorization, application, comprehension. On the competence-based assessment level, it also focuses on the assessment for learning. So competence-based education achieves this using a set of competency assessment tools and formative assessments to give prompt feedback to students, which then ultimately helps them to master their objectives. There's another important aspect about competence-based education, as the idea of competence-based education is totally against the notion of assessing all students at the same point in time. So looking at it from a communicating progress perspective, competence-based education believes that standard grading policies kill the lifelong learning skills of the students. So here, another reference to lifelong learning. Hence, it focuses on mastery-based grading by giving effective feedback and guidance until the students demonstrate their proficiency. And here again, a reference to the role in teaching, as in giving feedback, giving effective feedback. So the traditional way of teaching focused on periodic report cards with grade level marking. That was outcomes of assignments, tests, and performance. And what I've been not realizing, but what I experienced at our university from a student's perspective, that was exactly what they wanted to know. So they wanted to know, what do I need to do to accomplish this and that grade, which obviously is leading or misleading and going towards the totally wrong direction. And it doesn't focus anymore on mastering proficiency, but receiving the perfect grade and not focusing on lifelong learning. Second last is the skill-based training program that ensures the quality of competence-based education. So competence-based education has its faculty and small and medium-sized enterprises to define the rigorous competences first, followed by defining them and getting them validated by third-party partners. So the idea behind this network was to develop quality standards for institutions to come up with high quality programs in the end. Because in the end, it's about achieving outcomes, which in the end is nothing but the student success. At last, the question of affordability. Since students are the primary respondents of competence-based education, institutions need to design competence-based education programs with the affordability factor in mind. Obviously, on a large scale, the cost of those programs differs by institution, program, and student pace. So the faster a learner gets to demonstrate his skills, the lesser is his program fee. But in most cases, competence-based education programs are online offerings with reduced operating costs that eliminate high tuition fees. So another factor that emphasizes the benefits of competence-based education from a student perspective, with having to pay lower tuition fees. So looking at innovation from a pedagogical perspective in higher education, there has been research done by Anne May Waller, and she did research looking at the concept of pedagogical innovation in higher education. So what is understood by pedagogical innovation? And I would like to highlight the main points there. So from her research, one of the highlights are that the 21st century university institutions are experiencing a mutation of its teaching practice, mainly dictated by laws or political directives, but subsequently implemented by establishments, but also by the isolated action of innovative professors. So you have various stakeholders that are interfering and creating a space where there is already an ongoing transformational process in the way higher education will look like in the 21st century. So those 7 distinctive notions of the concept of pedagogical innovation are novelty, change, technopedagogy, reflection, improvement, application, and human relation. So when looking at novelty, it encompasses the sub-themes of novelty, surprising students, not what everyone does, and contrary to the norm. So the idea is, it represents the idea of novelty that is very apparent in the interviewed professor's conception of pedagogical innovation. So it is in particular a question of a new way of teaching that is different from the usual practice, by maybe surprising students when implemented. So that's something I've always found when teaching at our university. When you try to create something new, students were surprised to not see the classical frontal teaching experience, but rather a more interactive, competence-based approach. So the notion of change includes sub-themes of changing, adapting, but also leadership, temporary and unlimited. From Walden's research, the professors that were interviewed used the notion of change to explain the introduction of a change in their teaching. It can be slight or radical, but the results show that change also refers to an adaptation. But the notion of reflection, and this leads to one aspect I found very important, is the reflection when trying out something new, testing something, creating a new learning space, but also reflecting my own pedagogies. And this is something that was deeply implicated in the interviewed professor's conception of pedagogical innovation. So something to keep in mind when applying or trying to be innovative. Reflection plays a very critical part in innovation. The notion of application looks at sub-themes like a process, linking to the discipline, linking it to the audience, maybe linking it to technology, different levels and impacts, using new tools. So this notion of application appeared to be crucial in the conception of pedagogical innovation. The notion of improvement includes, for example, improving, making the subject understood, looking at quality, and then also at success. Again, here, although it was less frequently mentioned, this notion is also one of the facets of the interviewed professor's conception of pedagogical innovation, often described as a desire to make the subject understood. The notion of technology versus pedagogy, it emerged from the verbatim as a clarification on behalf of the participants who explained the distinction that they draw between pedagogical innovation and technical innovation. So interestingly, they only perceive something as a pedagogical innovation when it is constructed by pedagogical thinking. Thus, it seems that the participants are now denouncing a recurrent confusion between technological innovation and pedagogical innovation, which they resolutely and collectively wish to clarify. So this is a very tricky aspect to consider. And at last, the notion of human relations, looking at innovation being constructed within relations, moving closer to one's pedagogical ideal, learning as a professor, taking risks, and linked to the teacher's personality. So this final notion appeared in the interview's conception of pedagogical innovation and collates all the elements relating to a professor's human and personal aspects. It looks at things that, for example, risk-taking, but it also recalls that pedagogical innovation is a learning opportunity for the professor. So another interesting aspect in this area is that the professor or teacher becomes the learner as well. So another interesting highlight out of this research, that innovative pedagogies or pedagogical innovation has to also do something with the way we teach, the way we perceive our teaching, and the way we reflect it and relate to it. There are 2 slides in this presentation I preferably would want to skip, because I think that we as teachers are quite aware of that. But yeah, there's research on the question of what makes a good teacher, what qualifies or what qualities does a good teacher need to have. Those are 10 qualities that I've listed in the presentation, but I am going to skip over them because I want to emphasize and come back to something that is, I think, more important for this presentation right now. So, and this is innovative higher education teaching and learning techniques. I've talked about one of those already beforehand, the so-called flipped classroom. So, and I'll just briefly summarize what I've said already. Inverting the classroom means that events that have traditionally taken place inside the classroom now take place outside the classroom and vice versa. So the idea, like I was saying beforehand, is that the content we have been giving in the classroom now happens at home, where the student is doing it self-paced, self-learning, and we as the teachers use the space, the classroom space, the meetings, the virtual presence meetings, whatsoever, to see what was understood and maybe go into much more, maybe be able to go into more detail of the various subjects that we are teaching. One second aspect I would like to mention, and I have been looking at that as part of one of our research projects that we're currently running, and it's called Around a Sense of Purpose, is the aspect of gamification and bringing gamification into the university, into the classroom. Because students' interests in gaming and technology are at an all-time high and make this method of teaching very popular. It is effective in part because students learn without having to engage in the so-called traditional learning process, because they practically learn without even realizing it. There is competition and scoring, which motivates and involves the students. Although it can be said that scoring doesn't affect the student learning, but it motivates them to try hard. Baldion, for example, used gamification to teach mathematics and increase students' involvement by designing a game that required using fractions and answering questions to advance to another stage. Although the students scored better in practical assignments, they performed poorly in written assignments and participated less in classroom activities, irrespective of being more motivated. A third innovative teaching and learning technique is called design thinking or classical case study. So the main concept of design thinking is that students learn by being exposed to real-life problems or case analysis and using procedures like group interaction, brainstorming, as well as many others to gain knowledge and enhance their critical thinking ability. So cases are selected for benefiting theoretical outcomes, and the relevant case is selected for a learning outcome. This method, for example, is helpful for postgraduate students who are willing to do a thesis to gain in-depth knowledge, for example. Graduate students can relate to their own experience, and undergraduate students can learn from seniors when using the case study approach. Another innovative higher education teaching and learning technique is self-learning, which to some extent is applied in the flipped classroom already. But self-learning can be understood a little bit broader because it's also about conducting maybe research, reading articles and books, or maybe even employing other platforms, which can be termed as a self-learning or self-directed learning. Rodney Stewart conducted a study in which 3 factors of self-learning were evaluated. One being self-management, so desire for learning as a second, and self-control. And interestingly, it was concluded that the respondents had a strong desire for learning, and they were expected to complete the undergraduate program and gain work experience. Self-management, on the other hand, had the lowest rating, indicating that the students had issues with planning and time management of their studies. So one aspect which is quite interesting, because that's something I've found very important, is being capable of managing the learning process. And last, social media. Learning and teaching platforms are no longer limited to books or traditional lectures, but different types of social media tools, that being blogs, video blogs, Twitter, LinkedIn, and many, many other platforms are being used both by students and professors. So the use of social media platform in the field of education obviously has always been a matter of debate. What is scientific, what isn't? But there are many positives and negatives to consider. Like, for example, Facebook or Wikipedia, Twitter, and blogs or other forms of social media have been used, and advantages have been observed, such as the students engaging with content, peer learning, for example, or promotion of critical thinking, or even self-directed learning, self-monitoring of the learning progress, or provision of a platform from which students can interact with lecturers. So there are pros and cons when it comes to social media, but it's still something we shouldn't neglect. So when it comes to innovative teaching competences, I was already talking about a current involved EU project called Around a Sense of Purpose. And this project had the main emphasis on designing a framework for teachers that teach about education for sustainable development. And the question of this project is, what competences do teachers need in order to be capable of teaching education for sustainable development? Those are the 12 competences that this project has finally condensed and created. And I would like to highlight one of those, because it very much interrelates with what I've been talking the last 1 hour. And it's innovation through creativity. So what we've done is we have assigned sort of learning outcomes. So what are the learning outcomes that the educator helps a learner to be able to afterwards? Because the idea behind creativity is that the educator encourages creative thinking and flexibility within their learners. And This is done by building on their experience and existing knowledge as a basis for creativity in responding to sustainability-related issues. So here again, this connection to real-world problems. But it's also about using their judgment to recognize when tried and tested approaches are appropriate, rather than assuming that new is always better. Like I was saying beforehand, it's not about reinventing the wheel always, but maybe it's sometimes taking something that is already existent and using that already tested approach. And it's also about developing ideas and creating innovations based on real-world scenarios, problems, and also sustainable entrepreneurial skills development. So here, the connection to the entrepreneurial perspective of innovation. Underneath those learning outcomes are so-called underpinning components. So in order to achieve those above learning outcomes, now it comes to the role of the educator. We as educators should be able to, for example, apply creative and innovative teaching techniques in relation to sustainability issues, positioning the teaching processes in the real world or simulated context. But we should also be able to facilitate the process of generating new ideas among learners. So facilitation is another key aspect in our teaching capacities. It's also about encouraging learners to critically evaluate existing alternatives developed by sustainability actors. And at last, it's about recognizing opportunities for building new value, that being socially, environmentally, or even economic benefits in a sustainable way from any given situation. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure whether you can fully see this table. This is another research that I've been looking into, and it's research conducted by Herodoto, and it's about innovative pedagogies of the future. Because my focus now for the last part is, where do we want to go with all what we've looked at during the last hour? So what do we need to focus on in future terms? And research has been done here looking at innovative pedagogies that can be used in future teaching scenarios, for example. And I will briefly talk about those 6 topics. So, formative analytics. Formative analytics are focused on supporting the learner to reflect on what is learned, what can be improved, which goals can be achieved, and how to move forward. So in contrast to most analytics approaches that focus on analytics of learning, formative analytics aims to support analytics for learning. So for a learner to reach his or her goals through smart analytics, such as visualization of potential learning paths or personalized feedback. Again, here, the important emphasis on giving effective feedback. So for example, these formative analytics might help learners to effectively self-regulate their learning. Looking at it from an innovative perspective, by using fine-grained data and reporting this directly back to students in the form of feedback or dashboards, the educational practice is substantially influenced and subsequently innovated. So in particular, instead of waiting for feedback from a teacher at the end of an assessment task, students can receive formative analytics on demand when they want to, or ask for the formative analytics that link to their own self-regulation strategies. So it's a process that happens rapidly and doesn't take too much time. The second one is teach back. The method of teach back is about 2 or more people to demonstrate that they're progressing toward a shared understanding of a complex topic. So it starts with an expert, could be a teacher or a more knowledgeable student, explaining their knowledge of a topic to another person who has less understanding. Next, the less knowledgeable student attempts to teach back what they have learned to the more knowledgeable person. If that is successful, the one with more knowledge might then explain the topic in more detail. If the less knowledgeable person has difficulty in teaching back, the person with more expertise tries to explain in a clear or different way. The less knowledgeable person teaches it again until both of them agree. So from the innovative aspect, the conversational partner in teachback could be an online tutor, fellow student, or it could also be an artificial intelligence system that provides a teachable agent. Place-based learning derives learning opportunities from local community settings. So these help students to connect abstract concepts from the classroom and textbooks with practical challenges encountered in their own localities. Like place can refer to learning about physical localities, but also the social and cultural layers embedded within neighborhoods, and engaging with communities and environments as well as observing them. From an innovative perspective, place-based learning reassociates learning with local contexts at a time when educators are under pressure to fit into national curricula and a globalized world. It seeks to re-establish students with a sense of place and recognize the opportunities of learning in and from local community settings using neighborhoods as the specific context for experiential and problem-based learning. Learning with robots, at this point, I'm going to skip, but I would like to take a look at learning with drones, which I found quite interesting because it's about the question of outdoor fieldwork. And outdoor fieldwork is a long-standing student-centered pedagogy across a range of disciplines, which is increasingly supported by information technology. So we use outdoor fieldwork, outdoor learning experiences, and create spaces of learning together with using information technology, like, for example, drones. So drone-based learning, a recent innovation, is being used to support fieldwork by enhancing students' capability to explore outdoor physical environments. When students engage in outdoor learning experiences, reflect on those experiences, and conceptualize the learning and experiment with new actions, they are engaging in experiential learning. So the idea with using those drones is that the learning experience can be rich and multimodal. And another key aspect is that learning takes place through research, scientific data collection, and analysis, because drones are typically used to assist with data collection from different perspectives and in places that can be difficult to access. So this is another advantage when using new technologies. At last, I would like to talk about citizen inquiry. So citizen science, and we've been having a couple of those projects at our university currently, looking at citizen science. It's an increasingly popular activity that has the potential to support growth and development in learning science. Active participation by the public in scientific research encourages this. So this is due to its potential to educate the public, creating a space where public meets academia, also including young people, and to support the development of skills needed for the workplace and contribute to findings of real science research. An experience that allows people to become familiar with the work of scientists and learn to make their own science has potential for learning. From an innovative perspective, citizen inquiry shows that one of the innovations of this approach is that it enables potentially any citizen to engage and understand scientific activities that are often locked behind the walls of experimental laboratories. Thinking scientifically should not be restricted to scientists. It should be a competency that citizens develop in order to engage critically and reflect on their surroundings. Such skills will enable critical understanding of public debates, such as fake news, and more active citizenship. This slide, or this graph, is a presentation of the standards of evidence, which was shown in the previous graph when it comes to the level of confidence. So, for example, level 4 was stated you have 1+ and independent replication evaluations that confirms these conclusions. So what can be seen from this table, there is only formative analytics where the level of confidence is at level 4. All the others are at 3 or 2, indicating that the captured data that shows positive change, but you cannot confirm you caused this. So there is still need in doing more research in those innovative pedagogies. Yes, now I'd like to move towards learning and skills acquirement, or acquiring from a student's perspective. Learning strategies, what are those, or what can they be? For example, crossover learning. Learning in an informal settings, such as museums and after-school clubs, can link educational content with issues that matter to learners in their lives. So these connections work in both directions. So the idea is that learning in schools and colleges can be enriched by experiences from everyday life. Informal learning can be deepened by adding questions and knowledge from the classroom. So using that technique to give students the opportunity to learn outside the classroom setting is another opportunity where learning is deepened. Learning through argumentation is another learning strategy for modern pedagogy. Like, students can advance their understanding of science and mathematics by arguing in ways similar to professional scientists and mathematicians, for example. Because argumentation helps students attend to contrasting ideas, which can deepen their learning. It makes technical reasoning public for all to learn, and it also allows students to refine ideas with others, so they learn how scientists think and work together to establish or refute claims. So teachers, or we as teachers, can spark meaningful discussion in classrooms by encouraging students to ask open-ended questions, restate remarks in more scientific language, and develop and use models to construct explanations. A third possible learning strategy is incidental learning. So incidental learning is unplanned or unintentional learning. It may occur, for example, while carrying out an activity that is seemingly unrelated to what is learned. And early research on this topic dealt with how people learn in their daily routines at their workplaces. This kind of learning may trigger self-reflection, and it could be used to encourage learners to reconceive what could otherwise be isolated learning fragments as part of more coherent and longer-term learning journeys. A fourth learning strategy could be context-based learning. So context enables us to learn from experience. By interpreting new information in the context of where and when it occurs and relating it to what we already know, we come to understand its relevance and meaning. In a classroom or a lecture theater, the context is typically confined to a fixed space and limited time. But beyond the classroom, learning can come from an enriched context, such as visiting a heritage site or museum, or being immersed in a good book. Another strategy could be computational thinking. And this is a powerful approach to thinking and problem solving. It involves breaking large problems down into smaller ones, decomposition, for example, recognizing how these relate to problems that have been solved in the past, and setting aside unimportant details. It's also about identifying and developing the steps that will be necessary to reach a solution and refining these steps. So the aim is to teach students to structure problems so they can be solved. So computational thinking can be taught as part of mathematics, science, or art, or in other settings. Learning by doing science is another strategy. It's about engaging with authentic scientific tools and practices, such as controlling remote laboratory experiments or telescopes, can build science inquiry skills, and can improve conceptual understanding and increase motivation. So remote access to specialized equipment, first developed for scientists and university students, is now expanding to trainee teachers and school students. So we try to also create a space where people outside the university can use that as well. Another form of learning could be embodied learning. Embodied learning means involving self-awareness of the body interacting with a real or simulated world to support the learning process. So when learning, for example, a new sport, physical movement is an obvious part of the learning process. In embodied learning, the aim is that mind and body work together so that physical feedback and actions reinforce the learning process. One important aspect for us as teachers is the so-called aspect of adaptive teaching. Since all learners are different, we must be sure that the way we create learning spaces are different as well, because most of our education presentations and materials are the same for all. So this creates a learning problem by putting a burden on the learner to figure out how to engage with the content. It means that some learners will be bored, others might be lost, and very few are likely to discover paths through the content that result in optimal learning. And adaptive teaching offers a solution to this problem. It uses data about the learner's previous and current learning to create a personalized path through educational content. Like I was saying beforehand, when it comes to competency-based learning and education, this is a way forward. Well, another aspect and learning strategy could be the so-called analytics of emotion. There's been research done in psychology of learning when it comes to eye tracking and facial recognition. We can analyze how students learn, and then we can respond differently to their emotional and cognitive states. Obviously, something that is not that practical and easy applicable, but it's still something that could help us understand the way different students learn. Another aspect is so-called stealth assessment, because the automatic data collection that goes on in the background when students work with rich digital environments, and nowadays we have those rich digital environments, can be applied to unobtrusive stealth assessment of the learning processes. So the idea is that stealth assessment borrows techniques, for example, from online role-playing games, and here we come back to the gamification process of learning and teaching, that those online role-playing games such as World of Warcraft, in which the system continually collects data about the player's action, about the inferences that person makes, the goals and the strategies they're applying when it comes to tackling new challenges. So this is an aspect which is very important for us as teachers to maybe look into, is how can we understand the whole learning process from a more holistic perspective, I would say. So even within the European Union and the EU Commission, there has been this process and analysis of what are key competences, key skills our future students will need and will need to be competent with. One of those are, and I'm not going to too much detail of those, are digital competences, also entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial competences. But it's also about being multilingual, being literate, and still it's also about personal social skills and being capable of learning to learn. So metacognitive perspective of the learning process is very important and a key aspect. Let me come to my very last theoretical excursion of innovation and competence development. There's been research on future skills and the future of higher education by ELAS, and what was created was a so-called future skills profiles, that being an interactive map that looks at the future skills of our future students from various angles So we have 3 competence fields. Competence field 1 are the so-called subject development related future skills. And these relate to the development capability of one's own person, referred to here as individual or subject development related competences. Second, we look at the object-related skills. They relate to the handling of certain objects, work tasks, and problems. And then there are the organization-related skills, dealing with social, organizational, and institutional environment. So those are future skills our students will need to incorporate in some way or another, or competences they will later be able to apply in a workspace. Like I was mentioning beforehand, the reflective competence, for example, or the learning literacy, as in being able to learn, learning to learn, or knowing how to learn. But also others, as in communication competence, a future competence. So in terms of visualization, designing something new, creating a new product, a new service, whatsoever. And another aspect I was mentioning beforehand, the design thinking competence. So being able to create spaces, being able of analyzing cases, solving problems that are related to real-world issues, real-world scenarios. Systems competence is in understanding that we are living in a big system where there are different stakeholders and they relate to each other, and they have a cause and an effect of depending on which actions are applied within that system. At the very last part of my presentation, and slowly coming to an end of this presentation, I want to just briefly highlight one of our courses that we have applied at our university, and this course was called Sustainability, Culture, and Education. It took place in 2017. We had around 27 students from bachelor degrees, various studies. And the idea was to use a project-based approach, project-based learning approach. And it consisted of 2 phases, one theoretical introductory phase, as in introducing the concept of sustainability in the education, and then a practical phase with the idea of creating student projects, but not only ideas, but actually applying student projects, first planning them and then putting them into practice. And out of that came a couple different approaches or different student projects that were applied at last. One of them was a campus garden created by students, for students, where it was about harvesting vegetables, seeding vegetables and then harvesting at some point. but it was also about creating a sustainable university cafeteria. So we had a cafeteria, but the idea was to transform this cafeteria where only sustainable products would be served. So at the end, maybe I'd like to summarize what I wanted to highlight during my presentation. One of the key aspects when it comes to innovation and teaching practices and competence development of my students, but also competence development from a teacher's perspective, is that our educational system is at the brink of transformation, and I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to reflect our roles as teachers in terms of what are the skills we want to provide our students with when they leave university. So what are the skills they should be encompassing in terms of being capable of then applying in future work scenarios? And I think that's a very important aspect. And for that, I think there needs to be a broader discussion on that, and also a participatory approach where not only from a university level, but also by incorporating the companies, the organizations, future students will then later on work for. So I think those are the scenarios we're currently facing, and I think it's very important that we as teachers need to be reflecting on our personal role, but also on the skills that we want to provide our students with. So thank you once again for your invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you. And now I'm happily answering any of the questions that popped up during the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Schrack. Muchas gracias al profesor Lucas por acompañarnos y por hacer esta presentación tan interesante y digamos tan compleja, tan densa, porque hay mucha información allí. Pues darle paso a las preguntas de los asistentes. Yo les había sugerido y les vuelvo a recomendar que nos hagan sus preguntas a través de la ventana de preguntas y respuestas de la plataforma, para de allí recoger pues como lo que le podemos presentar al profesor en este momento como inquietudes. Me voy a permitir leer algunas de las que tenemos y pues darle obviamente en la medida el tiempo al profesor. Tenemos hasta las 12 para esta conversación. Voy a empezar por aquí. En Colombia, la mayoría de expertos y autoridades son muy exigentes en cuanto a lo que se puede llamar innovación o no. La definición que usted nos brinda es muy amplia y genera una visión muy amable y amplia de innovación. ¿Qué opina de que esas exageraciones en algunos casos desaprueben o descalifiquen lo que puede ser considerado esfuerzos por innovar? Creo que está claro, así que adelante, profesor.
Thank you very much for this question. And I will come to that question in a second, but I would like to emphasize one aspect that one person has written in the Q&A session concerning the literature that I've used for, and I will provide you with the slides, including the literature I have reflected upon. So I will look into that and provide you with the amended presentation by the end of this week. So coming back to your question, maybe let's just go back to the very first slide. And that's exactly why I use those two definitions, because they create this problem of understanding what is actually innovation. And most of the time, innovation is seen from a sustaining innovation perspective. So it's not about creating something totally new. Yeah, it's more about amending something, yeah, which to some extent could be innovative, yes, because sometimes it's not about reinventing the wheel, but it's maybe adapting something which can be innovative in educational terms as well. So, for example, using a certain teaching technique, yeah? Like, for example, the flipped classroom technique, which is a question that is part of the Q&A there as well. So I would consider that being innovative in terms of that we are not giving content as a teacher, but rather giving the students the opportunity to explore the content by themselves in their own pace, in their own time, and then coming back to the classroom where we have the opportunity to deepen the discussion on the content that was to be explored. So I would consider that innovative in terms of I'm innovating my methods of teaching, but I wouldn't consider it, for example, disruptive innovation. So maybe coming back to the definition of disruptive innovation, one of the key, or one example of disruptive innovation is, for example, the introduction of iTunes, which revolutionized the entire music industry, the way we listened to music. I mean, iTunes has now transformed into other platforms that we're using, but it was one element that triggered a change in music industry, which can be understood as a disruptive innovation. So I think innovation is tricky when it comes to what is innovation, yeah, and what makes it innovative. I think the question is, what do we want to achieve with innovation? And from a teaching perspective is, we want to change the way learning happens. So going back to, and that's my Austrian background, I suppose, going back to Maria Theresia, who introduced education in Austria, it was about discipline, about structure. It was a cadet academy, so a military academy. Yeah, that was the beginning of schools, yeah? The way schools worked. And also looking at universities 200 years ago, it was the professor who was like a god, yeah? Who had all the knowledge, and the students will come to him. But the question is, where does this lead us to? And like I was trying to say in my presentation, it's about the question of what are the skills we want to provide our students with, and with what innovative teaching practices can we trigger those skills. And yes, frontal desk teaching is one option, but there are various other innovative learning and teaching processes. And at least from my experience as a teacher at our university, the more loosely the learning happens, the more self-paced learning, still within the structure and still with some guidance and feedback as well, the more effective it is. So it's not a question about innovation, but it's a question of where does this innovation lead us, in terms of what does the future hold. And like I was saying in my presentation, the generation of my kids are probably going to work in jobs that are currently not existent. So there is obviously this future gap, yes, which is quite unknown, but I think one way to equip them with is with skills that are now more and more demanding and not just equip them with a certain degree. I hope I've understood your question, and I hope I've correctly or to some extent elaborated on your question.
Thank you so much. Y claro que sí. Pensaría que es bueno que conversemos también de los cambios necesarios que esta, digamos, nueva forma de concebir la educación adaptada a nuevos contextos, los cambios necesarios que habría que incorporar tanto a la figura del profesor, al rol docente, como a la estructura misma de las universidades. Cómo se tendrán que transformar las universidades y los docentes para, digamos, ajustarse y servir a esta nueva forma de comprender los procesos formativos.
Well, one of the key aspects I tried to highlight in my presentation is the notion of our role and understanding in teaching as being a teacher. What does it mean? So what is it? Is it about content giving, or is it about guiding a learning process? And if we come back to the concept of lifelong learning, then we want to equip our students with key skills that do not end at the end of a bachelor's or master's degree, but encourage and motivate the student to become lifelong learners. And that happens on the one hand side in terms of being reflective, in terms of reflective of what my teaching provides. But it's also a question coming back to the learning outcomes. So competence-based education is very much about defining learning outcomes. Like I was trying to say with Bloom's taxonomy of learning. It's not about just memorizing content, but it's about being analytical, being critical. So us as teachers, I see in the role of, we do know our content and we know our study field, I suppose, but it's about providing the student with a learning setting where they can decide for themselves take in. So, and when we define it through competencies, then we can clearly say, okay, competence A is that my students understand, on the one hand side, I'm just taking an example, education for sustainability, for example. What does education for sustainability stand for? That's one aspect. The second aspect would then be, for example, that my students are capable of critically reflecting the different approaches to education for sustainable development. So it's a question of creating learning spaces where it's not just about content, and then coming back to the method of the flipped classroom, but more of a learning space where the content can be reflected, critically analyzed, contrasted, falsified, whatsoever.
Okay, okay,
And
muchas
maybe, I'm
gracias.
sorry, maybe just coming back to that, obviously the university in total, as in the university structure, the university dean, president, and whatsoever, need to provide, obviously, the teachers the opportunity to create that space, by creating curricula where this form of teaching is allowed.
Oh, claro que sí, y en ese sentido también preguntar por como la brecha que hay entre esta concepción de educación superior basada en competencias y para la innovación, en contraste con de pronto una educación básica y media un poco más centrada en contenidos o más tradicional como todavía ocurre en Colombia. ¿Cómo podemos hacer para recibir en la universidad y orientar el proceso de formación de jóvenes que llegan con una, digamos, mentalidad que ha sido formada en el contexto de lo tradicional y hacer como ese cambio hacia la formación basada en competencias y para la innovación y la creatividad en contexto? ¿Cómo asumiríamos ese cambio de mentalidad en los estudiantes que pasan del sistema básico a la universidad?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. In Germany, we're facing obviously the very same. So we have traditional schools, and it's about learning and passing the exams. And that's what I was saying in my presentation. Students' reaction of me doing something completely different would then still be, so what do I need to get an A for? So what are the tasks that I need to fulfill? I guess it comes down to what I tried to say here. When it comes down to novelty. So the idea is try to be creative in terms of trying out something new, experimenting with something, and because the thing is, at first it's novel, so students would be like, okay, what's happening? But in the end, if the culture of teaching and learning is transformed and more people are going to do that, then obviously it's not going to be a novel thing anymore, but more of a, okay, that's the way we're doing it now. And to be honest, obviously we need to go back to the school education there as well. And yes, of course, difficult task and not something that can be changed within a second. But that kind of teaching and learning needs to change as well. I just want to briefly say, for example, I had a workshop today with a German school, which is quite innovative in the way they provide teaching and learning. So it's a lot where students are self-taught and self-learning, and small group kind of learning happens. But this is something that is very unusual in German schools. So this is a very innovative school and was just founded 8-9 years ago. So still something very new. And I think that's, but this needs to be the trend, I suppose, within the next 10 to 15 years, or else we are probably going to lose a lot of students and pupils in the learning process.
Aquí quisiéramos preguntarle ahora propiamente por la experiencia, digamos, vivida en su universidad, y es cómo ha sido o cómo ha ocurrido la preparación de sus profesores para asumir este reto de la innovación pedagógica. ¿Cómo ha ocurrido en la universidad? ¿Cómo han podido implementar ese cambio de mentalidad en los profesores?
Yeah, to be honest, I would say, well, well, you can say at our university there has been probably, I would say 6 years ago or 7 years ago, the university started into looking at competence-based education and how to apply that. And we even created a framework where it was defined what are the key competences our students need to learn and when they finish university degrees. And then this debate stopped. So we do have a framework. It's hidden somewhere in the treasures of the internet. In terms of, you can't even find the framework online anymore. It's not on the website because I was looking for it the last couple of months ago. And the discussion and debate on that has actually completely stopped. So to be honest, I must say our university right now is not doing a very good job at being innovative in terms of doing what we should be doing, in terms of having a discussion, a bigger debate, because obviously then because of the pandemic, the last year and a half, it has been a lot about online teaching skills. Yeah, so how can we provide our students still with courses and classes, radically shifting from a presence university to an online university. And then the debate and discussion on competence development has sort of evaporated. So I think that's still something that we need to come back to, because I think, yes, there is a demand and there is an urgency, and there are teachers that are applying that, but I would say the majority still isn't. And that's because either they were left out of the debate or they decided not to participate in the discussion. So that's, I think, a very crucial and important aspect we as University of Fechte still need to look into.
Bueno, yo creería que es un reto que en general estamos enfrentando todas las universidades del mundo en este momento, y es casi que esa misma situación de que este discurso vaya como penetrando cada vez más en la comunidad de profesores. Todavía estamos en una etapa muy incipiente. Aquí quiero cambiar el tema a una última pregunta porque se nos está agotando el tiempo, acerca de lo que usted mencionaba como educación sostenible. Hay una pregunta en el chat acerca de cuáles serían las características o las 3 características que pueden definir esto que usted denominó como educación sostenible.
Can you maybe repeat your question again?
Sí, pero pues decía que nos están preguntando por lo que se denominó en la charla educación sostenible, y qué es lo que caracteriza o cuáles son las principales características de una educación sostenible.
So, as I was trying to say, by sustaining, or the definition of sustaining innovation, it was more of understood or defined in terms of that we have a product, we have a service, which functions well. And the idea is, how can we make it better, bigger, more efficient, more beneficial? So it's about updating something. And to be honest, this is exactly what I was saying in terms of key characteristics from a teaching perspective would be looking at our teaching. So what are the practices of teaching that we're doing? And is that beneficial to the end user, our student? And how can we maybe do it more efficiently by changing, for example, the practices of our teaching, by, for example, applying a flipped classroom methodology. So the idea behind sustaining innovation in those terms is we are not creating something completely new, but we are using the same system, the same product, the same service, and just try to make it better, more user-friendly, more beneficial for the learning outcomes, for example. Yeah, I hope that made this a little bit clearer.
Vale, muchas gracias. Para cerrar, queremos darle la palabra a uno de los asistentes al evento que quiere hacer su intervención pues, de viva voz. Así que adelante el profesor Juan David Acevedo. Puede abrir el micrófono, Juan David.
Sí, ya tiene permiso para habilitar.
Sí, es que lo abra, que lo tiene cerrado, estoy viendo. No se desconectó, no lo veo. No sé qué le pasa al profesor que pidió la palabra y no está habilitando su micrófono. O no sé, Juan Fernando, ¿qué me sugieres? Yo creo que ya igual estamos llegando al final de la jornada, son las 12. Yo voy a cerrar entonces más bien, despedirnos, agradecerle muchísimo al profesor Lucas Cherac su presentación, este acompañamiento que nos ha hecho durante esta jornada, agradecer pues todo lo escuchado y lo aprendido, recordarles a todos que en sus correos electrónicos tienen o van a tener la actualización como de los archivos que está quedando de cada una de las ponencias. Se les comparten las presentaciones, las grabaciones de los 3 eventos que llevamos y esperarlos la semana próxima para el evento final, el cuarto webinar de este ciclo que se programó entre la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad de Antioquia, el Servicio Alemán de Intercambio Académico, la Universidad de Werther en Alemania, la Universidad Técnica del Norte de Ecuador y pues nuestra unidad de innovación de la Universidad de Antioquia. Con esto pues cerrar este encuentro y esperarlos a todos la próxima semana, agradeciendo mucho su asistencia. Hasta entonces.
Muchas gracias también.
Thank you so much.
Thank you much.
Thank you so much. Until next time. No sé cómo cerramos, paramos, grabación se separó.